Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy, where we bring you the stories behind the health headlines.
This podcast is brought to you by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Body Cream. 800-345-7339, on the web at uttercream.com. Stress has been linked to negative health consequences from asthma to heart disease. Can stress be our friend instead of our enemy? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
We've heard that stress is bad for our health. It can trigger asthma, alter our immune system, and perhaps even increase our risk of developing cancer. We've been encouraged to practice stress reduction. But what if, instead of fighting stress, we learned how to make it our ally?
Dr. Kelly McGonigal is a psychologist who has turned stress on its head. She maintains that handled properly, stress can help us perform better in challenging situations.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, the upside of stress, why stress is good for you, and how to get good at it.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, butter should no longer be demonized. That's the conclusion of a new study from researchers at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University. The investigators reviewed 9 studies with more than 600,000 subjects in 15 countries. They were able to assess butter consumption, which ranged from about 1/3 of a tablespoon to roughly 3 tablespoons daily. They also analyzed the data to see whether butter increased the risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, or death. Perhaps surprisingly, there was no association between butter consumption and heart disease. If anything, butter seemed to reduce the risk of diabetes marginally. We can't make cause and effect inferences from this analysis. It does suggest that butter might be more neutral in its consequences for health than its reputation implies. These findings are consistent with those of the Minnesota coronary experiment. Although that study was conducted between 1968 and 1973, the results were recently published in the BMJ. They showed lower cardiovascular mortality among people getting more saturated fat compared to vegetable oil.
Omega-3 fatty acids found in fish, flaxseed, and certain other foods are associated with a slight reduction in the likelihood of fatal heart disease. This question has been controversial, with some studies suggesting that fish oil protects the heart and others showing little or no benefit from consuming fish oil. This analysis reviewed data from 19 studies with 45,637 participants from 16 countries. All of these studies had collected blood or tissue samples that showed levels of omega-3 fats. The scientists found in their analysis that plant-based and marine omega-3 fats were both linked to a slightly lower risk of a fatal heart attack. The reduction was about 10%. There was no association between omega-3 levels and non-fatal heart attacks. The senior author noted that these results lend support to the importance of fish and omega-3 consumption as part of a healthy diet.
Tart cherries have been shown to improve performance and help marathon runners recover faster. Now, a new double-blind, placebo-controlled study has found that tart cherry powder lowered inflammatory markers in athletes who ran a half marathon. They were given 480 milligrams of powdered Montmorency cherries or placebo for 7 days before the race, the day of the race, and 2 days after. After the race, those who had received the cherry powder experienced less soreness and also had lower levels of physiological indicators of stress. Those who had taken tart cherry powder also ran 13% faster and stayed closer to their predicted race pace. The scientists suggest that tart cherry powder may be reducing muscle damage.
It's estimated that 60% of women experience one or more urinary tract infections during their lives. Over 10 million doctor visits each year can be attributed to a UTI. Cranberry juice has a long-standing reputation for both preventing and treating UTIs, but questions have been raised about the effectiveness of this alternative approach to antibiotics. A randomized, placebo-controlled trial of women who had a recent history of urinary tract infection found that consuming 8 ounces of cranberry juice daily reduced recurrence by 40%.
For decades, women have scheduled annual pelvic exams as part of their preventive health care. Now, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force says maybe that's not necessary. The expert panel didn't say that pelvic exams cause harm. Rather, they couldn't find adequate evidence that routine exams, in the absence of symptoms, improve women's health or help prolong their lives. The uncertainty only applies to women who have no symptoms such as pain or bleeding and who are not pregnant. And the uncertainty about pelvic exams does not extend to pap smears to detect cervical cancer. The task force is clear on the benefits of that screening, but for most women, that screening is every 3 years rather than annually. Women are urged to talk with their doctors about whether they need an annual pelvic exam. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. We've all been told that stress is our enemy, that it can cause both mental as well as physical harm. If we're stressed out, we've been warned that our cortisol levels will go up, that we'll be more vulnerable to infection, heart disease, asthma, skin problems, and maybe even cancer.
There's been a lot of attention devoted to trying to control our stress and chill out through meditation, deep breathing, calming music, yoga, tai chi, cognitive behavioral therapy, and other forms of relaxation. But what if we could learn how to make stress our friend instead of our adversary?
To help us do just that, we're speaking with Dr. Kelly McGonigal. She's a health psychologist and a lecturer at Stanford University. Dr. McGonigal is author of the international bestseller, The Willpower Instinct, How Self-Control Works, Why It Matters, and What You Can Do to Get More of It. Her latest book is The Upside of Stress, Why Stress is Good for You, and How to Get Good at It.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. McGonigal.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Dr. McGonigal, we've been told for decades that stress is bad for us, that it's our enemy. It raises blood pressure, increases our risk for heart disease and cancer, as well as other chronic conditions. We're all supposed to reduce stress by meditating, doing yoga, or other calming practices. Now, you come along and you suggest that stress could be good for us? What gives?
Yes. So as a health psychologist and somebody who studied medicine, I was told, too, for, decades that stress really is the enemy and that, if we don't reduce or avoid stress, that we are doomed to experience the kind of outcomes that you mentioned, the illness, the depression, the unhappiness. And what I'm really interested in right now is this new body of research that suggests that even the desire to avoid or reduce stress may actually be more harmful for us in the presence of stress in our lives. And that if we actually take a new approach to stress, one that says we can embrace it and transform it into something positive, that all of those side effects that we think of as the inevitable consequence of stress actually are not inevitable. And that having stressful lives, being stressed out, can actually have benefits in our lives. But that a lot seems to hinge on how we think about stress and how we talk about stress.
Dr. McGonigal, what caused you to do this reevaluation?
Well, so, I had basically made a career out of telling people how to avoid stress or how to reduce stress. And in 2011, I came across this medical study that made me really reevaluate how I was talking to people about stress. This was a study done at the University of Wisconsin that tracked about 30,000 adults for 8 years. And at the beginning of the study, they asked them how stressful their lives were. And they were interested in seeing, is it true that stress kills you? So they were going to track people over the next decade to see if people who had very stressful lives were more likely to die than people who had less stressful lives. But they also asked a really interesting question in that study. They asked the adults if they believed that their stress was harmful for their health, right at the beginning of the study. And what they found was this really interesting interaction between stress and beliefs about stress, where the people who were most at risk for dying were the ones who had a lot of stress in their lives and strongly believed that that stress was harmful. People who had really stressful lives and didn't view their stress as harmful actually seemed to be protected against dying, that they were the most likely to be alive. They were the most resilient. And it wasn't the presence of stress that seemed to be really predicting mortality rates. It was this mindset towards stress, this belief that stress was harmful. And the researchers actually estimated that it was killing about 20,000 Americans a year, that combination, that belief that stress is bad for you. And when I saw that figure, my head pretty much exploded because I had made a career out of telling people that stress was harmful. And here was this really well-conducted epidemiological study saying that that very message itself might be doing more harm than good. And so that study, which again came out in 2011, basically sent me on a hunt, on a journey to find out whether how you think about stress really matters. And if there's a different way of talking about stress and relating to stress in our own lives that can create that kind of protective effect that study found, where having a stressful life isn't necessarily harmful and may actually confer benefits.
Dr. McGonigal, before we go any further, let's define stress, because there's all kinds of stress. I mean, there's the stuck in traffic stress. There's the, I'm late to the wedding or the funeral stress. There's the behind on deadline stress, something that we experience almost every week. There's the debt stress. So what do we mean when we say stress?
Yeah, this is a surprisingly difficult question because we do use the word stress to describe pretty much any experience we don't want to have. I mean, we look at sort of a functional definition. People say they're stressed when they're anxious. People say they're stressed when they're angry. People say they're stressed when they have a deadline. But we also use the word stress to describe what I would really refer to as suffering, things like depression, trauma, loss and grief. And sometimes we use the word stress to describe what's happening to us, the situation. There's so much stress in my life. And sometimes we use the word stress to describe what we're feeling, what's going on in our bodies, our emotions and our thoughts. And, there's no one definition that really is going to include everything that people mean when they use the word stress. So I picked a definition that I think actually helps us take a more useful and constructive attitude towards stress. And the definition I like to use is that stress is what arises when something you care about is at stake. And that really puts the emphasis on the experience that we have. Stress is your heart pounding. Stress is your mind racing. Stress is the adrenaline that's flooding through your body. Or, stress is the motivation that makes you want to take action. Stress is really something that we experience, and we only experience it when something matters to us. And I think that talking about stress in that way really gives us a better way to relate to stress, right? Because we have a little bit more control over how it is that we choose to respond to the experiences in our life. And I think probably one of the most unhelpful ways of talking about stress is to define it as circumstances in our lives, particularly circumstances that we can't control, like traffic or even something more serious like loss.
Well, let's drill a little deeper because, as you've pointed out, there's this word that is sort of this, garbage pail for just about everything that could be difficult, challenging in our lives, whether it's stuck in traffic or whether it's the loss of someone who we really love. And I don't think we're very good at distinguishing between these various kinds, as you said. So you've come up with a really cool definition, the things that really matter to us. So how important is it? I mean, we've all been told, this is really bad stuff. I mean, when something bad has happened, you get fired from your job. You lose something that's really important to you, that now you're under stress, and maybe the best way to deal with that is a prescription for a benzodiazepine like Valium or Librium or Xanax or fill in the blank, alprazolam, and that'll calm you down. Or maybe you need to go see a clergyman and, have a little chit chat, or a therapist such as yourself. So help us understand, what should we do when we're under that kind of stress regarding something that really matters to us?
Yeah. Well, so those coping strategies that you suggested, they really run the gamut. Talking to a clergy member is really not the same thing as trying to numb your pain. And I think that when you look at what research says on the best way to handle real stress, the kind of stress we might also label as suffering, one of the things that really stands out is that the desire to escape or avoid the inner experiences of stress is probably the worst thing that you can do to cope with serious stress, whether it's anxiety, depression, grief, anger, physical pain, those coping strategies we choose that are really about, I can't stand the way I'm feeling. I don't want to have these intrusive thoughts. So how can I get rid of them or escape them? And then you see people trying to get drunk to not feel their stress, or trying to numb themselves by binge watching television or shopping or gambling, or whatever it is that people use to try to get away from the reality of their lives. And in some cases, turning to prescriptions may be an example of that. That mindset that says, I can't handle the experience that I'm having, and so I need to find a way to suppress it or get away from it. In fact, some studies that also had a really big impact on how I think about stress found that if they ask people, how do you try to relate to the stress in your life, people whose goals or coping strategies are to try to avoid stress end up much more likely to suffer the worst outcomes of chronic or severe stress. So they're more likely to become depressed. They're more likely to experience post-traumatic stress disorder. They're more likely to experience health problems. And there seems to be something that is particularly destructive about trying to avoid this definition of stress that I've offered, those things that arise when something you care about is at stake, is threatened, or is lost. And the other coping strategies that you mentioned, things like talking to someone about what's going on in your life, right? That's not necessarily the same kind of harmful stress avoidance or stress suppression. And in the book, when I talk about how to get good at stress, a lot of what I'm talking about is how to shift from that avoidance way of relating to stress, looking for how to escape it, to something that psychologists might call an approach orientation to stress that accepts the reality of what's happening in your life. And rather than trying to use all of your energy and resources denying or suppressing or escaping it, look at how to use other resources in your life, whether it's seeking social support, whether it's drawing on your own strengths, whether it's relying on faith, that there are other ways of more actively meeting the stress in your life that are likely to then transform that stress into something positive, like personal growth, like greater connection or relationships with others.
You're listening to Dr. Kelly McGonigal, health psychologist and lecturer at Stanford University. She's a fitness instructor and a meditation teacher. Her books include The Willpower Instinct, How Self-Control Works, Why It Matters, and What You Can Do to Get More of It. Also, her most recent work, The Upside of Stress, Why Stress is Good for You, and How to Get Good at It.
After the break, we'll hear about a study at the Trauma Center in Akron. What did the research show about people's ability to recover psychologically from a trauma?
What are the different kinds of stress responses?
How can you transform stress from an overwhelming challenge to a useful ally?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. 800-345-7339. The website, uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1009. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
We are talking today about stress, and our guest has an unusual take on the topic. Dr. Kelly McGonigal is a health psychologist. She lectures at Stanford University, and today we're discussing her new book, The Upside of Stress: Why Stress is Good for You, and How to Get Good at It.
Dr. McGonigal, in your book, you describe a study that was carried out at the Trauma Center in Akron, Ohio, and I'm curious, what could we learn from that study?
This was a study that really surprised me, and it was just one of many studies that actually found the same surprising finding. This was a study that looked at people who had recently gone through a motor vehicle accident. It was very traumatizing. And when they showed up at the trauma center, they were enrolled in a study looking at whether people's physical stress responses after something traumatic could predict who would go on to be resilient and not really suffer a lot of psychological consequences of that trauma versus who would go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder and really be continually affected in a harmful way by that traumatic experience. And so these trauma survivors, they peed into a cup, they gave their urine samples, and researchers analyzed the levels of different stress hormones. And what they found was that the trauma survivors who had the highest levels of what we often think of as being the harmful stress hormones, like cortisol and adrenaline, that the trauma survivors who had the highest levels of stress hormones after their traumatic experience were the most likely to be resilient. And if you looked at the people who weeks and months later were really struggling to move on, they were having a lot of flashbacks, they were unable to get in a car, they were afraid of being on the highway, they were trying to avoid thinking or talking about the experience because it was still so raw and so hard to deal with. Those were folks who had had smaller physical stress responses to the trauma. And there's a growing body of research suggesting that when we experience stress, the stronger our physical stress response, the better the outcome. And this is true not just looking at trauma, but things like performance, that students who have stronger adrenaline rushes during an exam are going to outperform students who are much calmer during the exam. And there seems to be something, really basically functional about our stress response, that our bodies and our brains are built to help us rise to the challenge, whether it's something like performing well on an exam or whether it's finding a way to cope with and become resilient to the really difficult experiences in our lives. And I love this set of studies because it's one of those big mindset shifts that we're so used to thinking of the stress response as being inherently toxic. We've all been told the fight or flight response, it's no good for us. It was only good back in the days when we were running away from predators or fires. And, the fight or flight response is just such a bad strategy for dealing with the stress of modern life. And in fact, our stress response has evolved just as humans have. And in many ways, our stress response is our best ally and resource. And we have so many different types of stress responses that help us deal with all of the types of modern challenges we face. And stress really isn't something that we should be suppressing. It's much more important to think about how to really unleash the benefits of the stress response instead of feeling like our body is betraying us every time our heart pounds from anxiety.
I love the idea that really our stress reactions have evolved with us. You mentioned that there are many different kinds of stress responses. Could you run through a few of them, please?
Sure. So the one that most people have heard about is the fight or flight response. Psychologists sometimes call that a threat response. That's that kind of stress response you have when you feel deeply threatened, and it's a kind of a survival instinct. Your heart will pound and you'll start sweating and your body is mobilizing energy to help you basically defend yourself against an emergency. But there are so many other types of stress responses in our stress response repertoire. One that's almost exactly the opposite of a threat response is the tend and befriend response. And this is a very common response to stress, where instead of thinking about our own survival, our brain and our body, they start to produce hormones and neurotransmitters that motivate us to connect with others. Oxytocin is one of those neurohormones that really drive a tend and befriend response. So that the more stressed out we are, the more likely we are to want to help others, the more likely we are to want to be around people we care about. And a tend and befriend response also floods us with courage. It makes us more likely to take positive risks. It makes us more likely to have hope that our actions will be able to have positive consequences, that we can face the stress in our lives. And that's so different than the way we usually think about stress as making us self-defensive, selfish, hostile, or aggressive. Another type of stress response that is more closely related to a threat response is called a challenge response. And that's a type of response people have when they're really in a flow state, when there's something difficult they have to do and they know that they're capable of it. You see this in athletes, you see it in surgeons, you see it in performing artists, that people who are really ready to rise to the challenge, their hearts are pounding just like somebody who's having a threat response. But there are other differences that really maximize the amount of energy that your brain gets and the sort of the intelligence with which you're able to pay attention to your environment and respond to things that are happening. And a challenge response is a much healthier response to the types of situations we sometimes have a threat response in. So one of the things I talk about in the book is, well, how do you go from someone who maybe is used to having a threat response to everything stressful in your life to being able to have a tend and befriend response that gives you hope and courage? Or how do you shift to having a challenge response that really helps you do your best under pressure instead of collapse, to be paralyzed by fear?
Dr. McGonigal, this sort of reminds me a little bit of a keto, where you're in a sense transforming energy, sort of blending with that threat and actually moving that threat to something that is in your own favor. Can you tell us a little bit about Professor Crum and her principles of Aikido?
Yeah, so Aaliyah Crum is actually one of the first stress mindset researchers, one of the first scientists to show that how you think about stress matters. And when I met her to talk about her research, I was very interested to find out that her father was an Aikido master and instructor. And so she had grown up with this awareness of this concept that how you choose to relate to energy can actually influence its effects. You can transform something that might initially be harmful energy and transform it into something positive by changing the way that you relate to it. And she was one of the first researchers to test this out with the idea of stress. For example, one of her studies puts people in a very stressful situation where they have to give a talk, and when they're trying to give their talk, they keep getting interrupted by people telling them how badly they're doing and analyzing everything that's wrong with their body language to the content of what they're saying. And in this stressful situation, some folks had been told that their stress response could really help them do well under pressure, that the stress response is really built to help you learn and grow. And then other people were given a very standard message about stress before the stressful situation, the kind of thing that we're all used to hearing, that, everyone knows that stress is bad for you, that stress can make you sick, that stress can make you choke under pressure. And then she looked at how those two different, very brief mindset interventions, just a couple minutes long, could actually change the way people experience this stressful situation. And she found that just shifting the mindset to viewing stress as something that can help you rather than something that will inevitably thwart you, change people's stress responses psychologically and physiologically, literally making the stress response healthier and making the stress response more helpful. One of the things that she looked at in that particular study that I found so fascinating was the degree to which participants were releasing a hormone called DHEA under stress. And some of your listeners may know DHEA because people take it as a supplement. Sometimes it's referred to as an anti-aging hormone. It's a precursor to testosterone, so it can make us physically stronger. And it's also a stress hormone that when you experience stress, it is very likely that your body will release higher levels of DHEA. in part because DHEA really helps you recover from stress. It's anti-inflammatory, it's good for your immune system, and it also helps your brain learn and rewire itself after a stressful experience to make your brain more resilient to future stress. And what Crum found in this one study is that people who had been told that stress could help them, they actually released higher levels of DHEA during a stressful situation that was designed to be educational, where they were supposed to learn something from it to get this critical feedback. And, would they be able to transform it into a positive experience of growth and learning? And their bodies and their brains actually shifted into a physiological state that made it more likely that this difficult, stressful learning experience would produce growth and resilience. And that's just an example of some of her research. She's done so many interesting studies showing that sort of the effect that you expect to get from a certain experience can actually determine the effect that you get. And particularly when it comes to stress, that expecting stress to be helpful can actually make it so.
Dr. McGonigal, you say that skipping the science and getting straight to the advice doesn't work. We have to know what's behind every strategy to make it stick. So can you tell us about some of the other science of stress studies that have had surprising results?
Sure. And I really do believe this, by the way, in part because so many of these ideas are counterintuitive. And if I were to just tell people, oh, no, stress is good for you, and it's really important to remember that stress is good for you. I mean, I feel silly sometimes just saying that. And yet the science is becoming really clear that stress can be helpful, particularly when we view it as such. And so some of my favorite studies are looking at how embracing anxiety can actually make anxiety helpful, which as someone who experiences anxiety, like that's the kind of message that's very hard for me to hear. I never experienced my anxiety as helpful until I started to learn about the science and started to apply some of the mindset resets that scientists have been developing to help people cope with their anxiety. For example, Jeremy Jameson, who's at the University of Rochester in New York, he's looked at how telling people that anxiety is energy can actually help them perform better under pressure, even people who have anxiety disorders, even people for whom anxiety really is a problem. And so he's taken people who are about to go through stressful situations and told them, hey, when you experience anxiety and your heart is pounding, that's your heart trying to give you more energy. If you're breathing faster, that's your body trying to get more oxygen to your brain. If you're sweating, all of those signs that we think of as being like the signals that we're going to fail, that we can't handle it, they're actually all signs that your body is trying to mobilize your resources. And that anxiety can actually help you do well. This is all true, by the way, despite the fact that a lot of people believe that anxiety impairs performance. When you actually look at it physiologically, that pounding heart, that adrenaline, it really does help people do well, even if they experience it as anxiety. So he's telling people the truth, but he's asking them to remember it when they're about to face a very stressful situation. And he's shown that remembering that anxiety can give you energy actually changes the physical response that people have to stress. It makes them more likely to have a challenge response rather than a threat response. It makes them feel more confident about their abilities. And it also makes the stress response healthier. It's healthier cardiovascularly. A new study that just came out from another group trying to replicate his studies, the study came out of Berkeley, found that it reduces inflammation during a stressful situation, in addition to boosting people's performance. And so this is one of my favorite ideas that's backed by science, that anxiety actually can be helpful, but it's particularly important to remember in the moment when you feel overwhelmed, when you're wondering whether or not you're going to be able to handle whatever the difficult situation is, to view your body and your own emotions as a resource rather than a barrier. And studies suggest that even if you aren't sure you believe it, that's the great thing about these mindset interventions. Just bringing the idea to mind seems to be enough to begin to create this transformative effect that we were talking about, to really transform that energy into something positive.
Dr. McGonigal, what you're talking about is nothing short of revolutionary, and I suspect that an awful lot of your colleagues, psychologists and other therapists, are listening in dismay. They're all going to go, freak out. Dr. McGonigal is telling us that what we're doing is counterproductive, doesn't work, that embrace your stress. And I can just imagine, people's heads are exploding all over the country.
Yes, and I can commiserate with them about that because I was there a few years ago as well, my own head exploding. There are a lot of ways to think about this that actually can help us, I think, relax a little bit around this tension between the idea that stress can be harmful and also the idea that we should embrace stress. One thing I want to say straight away is that it's not the case that stress is always helpful. Scouring the research, it seems like when stress is harmful, it's because certain conditions are in place. One is that the stress feels completely outside of your control and against your will. That is, you can see no meaning in it. You see no way to take any action that can have any effect on your experience. And it also feels like it isolates you from others, that you feel like you're alone in your stress, you're the only one who's suffering in this way, that nobody cares, and there's nothing that you can do either. Like, that's the context in which stress is really toxic, the sense that you are inadequate to your life and you are also alone in your suffering. And one of the things that I have become more clear about is that the way we talk about stress makes that context more likely to be people's reality. That when we tell people it is unacceptable if your life is stressful, that if you want to be successful at life, you shouldn't be experiencing stress. You shouldn't be anxious. You shouldn't be angry. You shouldn't be overwhelmed. That there's something wrong with your life if it's painful, if it's difficult, or if you experience stress. That message makes it more likely that people are going to feel alone in their stress and are going to feel overwhelmed by that stress, that it will feel against their will and without meaning. And so that's one of, I think, the things that I'm most passionate about now is not trying to convince people that there's no context or no, situation in which stress will be harmful, but that we should radically rethink the way we talk to people about their stress so that we don't accidentally set up the very psychological and social circumstances that will be the most disempowering and the most likely to lead to the outcomes we fear are related to stress.
You're listening to Dr. Kelly McGonigal, author of The Upside of Stress, Why Stress is Good for You and How to Get Good at It. She's a health psychologist and lecturer at Stanford University. Her previous book was The Willpower Instinct, How Self-Control Works, Why It Matters, and What You Can Do to Get More of It.
Terry, I really appreciate this idea of reframing stress, that you could possibly use those symptoms of your heart pounding, of your hands sweating, of breathing rapidly as energy resources to help you overcome a challenge.
Yeah, I like that idea a lot too.
We need to take a short break, but coming up, find out how we can use stress to improve our performance and our lives.
How did Dr. McGonigal learn to harness her fear of flying?
What is the biology of courage? And how does the hormone oxytocin play a role?
We'll find out how one Boston Marathon runner dealt with the tragedy.
And how did Dr. McGonigal's research change her own life?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening to this podcast of The People's Pharmacy. If you like it, why not rate or review it in the iTunes store? We'd appreciate it. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth foot cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel soft and smooth. The number 800-345-7339. Online at uttercream.com.
And by Squatty Potty, the original toilet step stool that creates healthy toilet posture. Learn how squatting relaxes the colon and allows for easier, healthier elimination at squattypotty.com.
To order a CD of this show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1009. That number again, 800-732-2334. Online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today we're talking about stress and how it can be helpful rather than harmful.
Our guest is Dr. Kelly McGonigal. She's a health psychologist and a lecturer at Stanford University. Dr. McGonigal is author of the international bestseller, The Willpower Instinct. Her latest book is The Upside of Stress, Why Stress is Good for You and How to Get Good at It.
Dr. McGonigal, you are writing about how stress can be helpful and how it can be good for us and how we can get good at it. So let's start talking about how we can use stress to make our performance or our whole lives better and richer.
Yes. So my favorite definition of what it means to be good from stress actually borrowed from a psychologist, Salvatore Maddi, who in the 1980s, he was really interested in what distinguished people who thrived in very stressful situations versus those who ended up, looking like the way we think stress usually affects people: sick, unhappy, less productive at work. And he came up with this phrase, the courage to grow from stress. That people who thrived, people who became healthier and happier and more engaged with life during difficult times were those who seemed to hold a set of attitudes and behaviors that he captured with that phrase, the courage to grow from stress. And that's really how I think about what it means to get good at stress, to really think about stress as a catalyst, that the difficult situations in our life, our own difficult emotions, and even our body's response to stress, that they are all there to be a catalyst for engaging with life, connecting with others, and finding a way to learn and to grow. And so to be good at stress basically means getting good at what your body and brain are actually trying to help you do with its stress responses, to give you energy, to help you take action when that's possible, to look for a way to connect with others rather than become isolated or withdraw, to use stress as a catalyst for seeking support or finding a way to be of service to others, and to take a growth mindset that really views every stressful circumstance as either an opportunity to learn something and grow as an individual or to express the values that are already meaningful and important to you, and to in that way really celebrate your strengths and your values.
Dr. McGonigal, our listeners, most people learn best from stories, from examples. Can you give us something concrete, some anecdotes that will demonstrate what you're talking about?
So one of the ways that I've gotten better at stress over the years is by tackling my own fear of flying. For years and years, I had a paralyzing phobia of flying. I refused to get on planes, which meant I didn't see a lot of my family members very often who lived on the other side of the country. I wasn't able to visit places that I wanted to see. It had a very profound impact on my life, and yet I really felt like I couldn't handle the anxiety or the panic that would come up when I thought about flying. And so I was taking that sort of classic avoidance approach to my stress, telling myself that if I didn't fly, then I wouldn't have to deal with the panic and the fear, and that was preferable to feeling the discomfort and the stress of thinking about flying or being on airplanes. And when I think about what it means to be good at stress, I really started to use all of those strategies to try to transform my phobia into something that was much more workable in my life. And one of the things that I had to do was decide that the entire concept of avoidance wasn't working. We had this idea that if we just avoid the things that trigger stress in our lives, we won't experience stress. And I had to realize that, well, actually, I was still feeling afraid. I just also was now dealing with the consequences of not being able to fly. But that avoiding the thing that I thought was stressful didn't actually get rid of the stress. It just made me feel trapped. And the fear and the panic didn't go away just by trying to control the stressful circumstances in my life. And so I had to think, okay, well, how would this be an opportunity to learn or to grow? What matters to me? And could this be an expression of what matters to me in a way that would allow me to choose getting on an airplane? And I started to think about all the people I work with who deal with other phobias or other really difficult inner experiences. I've worked a lot with people who've experienced addiction and a lot of people who've experienced trauma and loss. And I thought, well, it's really not so different, the people I work with who want to get drunk so they don't have to feel their feelings. That's really not so different than what I'm doing when I refuse to fly. And I was able to feel less alone, I think, in my experience when I sort of brought all of them into my mind when I thought about flying. Like, okay, we could all be in this together. And that my willingness to get on airplanes, despite fear, despite discomfort, was a way of really committing to something I care about, which is helping others, and that this was a way for me to cultivate that courage myself that I was asking other people to feel when they were having trouble engaging with their own lives without trying to avoid or suppress what they didn't want to feel. And now when I'm on airplanes, I actually use that very trick that we talked about in the previous segment about embracing the anxiety as energy. And rather than listening to, meditation tapes to try to calm down or, self-hypnosis to try to be relaxed on airplanes, I have a turbulence playlist I put on that's, really high energy music, including even a song called We Hit Turbulence. And I bounce around in my seat and I'm like, okay, this is energy. And I try to experience that energy and ride with it kind of like in a keto way, instead of sitting there on the airplane trying to calm down when my body is having an anxiety response to a situation that I can't control. And I think that, all of these different strategies that we've talked about, viewing stress as an opportunity to learn and grow, choosing to see our own stress as something that helps us connect with others, that we're not alone in it, and embracing the energy of it rather than trying to suppress it. I had to use all of those things to help me get over my fear of flying. And even though I still don't like flying, I do it several times a week. And changing my relationship with that particular stress has had an enormous impact on the quality of my life.
Wow, that is a great example. In the book, you write about the biology of courage. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? You've given us a great example of the psychology of courage.
Yes. So the biology of courage really comes down to, I think, two chemicals in the brain and the body. One, we've already talked about, oxytocin, which most people don't think of as a chemical of courage because they may have heard of oxytocin described in relationship to breastfeeding. It's something that helps moms bond with their babies. It's also released during sex. It's released when you stare in your dog's eyes and feel connected and bonded to your dog. It really is a social hormone, but it has this side effect in the brain of actually suppressing the fear circuitry of the brain, that when you feel close and connected to others, your brain actually gives you this boost of courage, in part because when we are connected, it's a really good time to take risks. It's a really good time to stand up for yourself or for what you care about because you are connected, right? You're bigger than self. And so when we are connected and having that bigger than self feeling, our brain gives us this extra courage by suppressing fear and anxiety in the brain. And the other chemical that goes along with it in terms of courage is dopamine, which is also a neurotransmitter people have often heard about, but in a totally different context, one of addiction or one of pleasure. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that makes us want to approach something. So, if you love chocolate and you see chocolate and you smell chocolate, your brain might release a bit of dopamine to make you go and reach out for the chocolate and put it in your mouth. And we've heard of dopamine in the context of pleasurable behaviors and the things that we really enjoy doing. But dopamine is also really important for getting us to take any sort of positive action. And so when you have high levels of dopamine and you have high levels of oxytocin in the brain, what it seems to do is give you this really positive pro-social courage, the kind of courage that makes you willing to do important things and take positive risks and be honest about your experience and do things that help you transform situations for yourself and others. And in the book, I talk about how your own mindset towards stress can help you create this biology of courage. One of the simplest ways to do it is to look for a way to help someone else out when you yourself are feeling stressed out.
Can you tell us a little bit about Natalie, is it Stavis?
Yeah.
And the 2013 Boston Marathon and how that relates?
So Natalie was running the Boston Marathon. She was just about finished when the bombs went off. She was just about to reach the finish line. And I write about her in the book because I think she's a great example of how stress can be a catalyst for courage. The first thing that happened for her was she thought she heard what were fireworks going off as she was approaching the finish line. And it wasn't until, a horde of people started running in the wrong direction that she realized that something must be wrong. And she immediately, her first thought was, I need to do something to help. And she was one of the first responders at the scene of the second bomb explosion. She ended up triaging, giving first aid, and applying CPR to, I think, 5 people, and I think 4 of them survived. But when I talked with her about it, she talked about how really that first instinct was to help. The first instinct wasn't to run for safety. And I use her as an example because I think that that kind of courageous response to stress or to suffering is really in all of us. And that cultivating a mindset that embraces stress rather than tries to avoid or suppress stress actually makes it more likely that we will have that courage in times of difficulty. In fact, psychologists call this altruism born of suffering, that actually the more open we are to the reality of stress and suffering in our own lives, the more likely we are to actually be courageous and to want to help others. And in the case of the Boston Marathon, people basically did whatever they could. There were people who were running after the marathon to donate blood because that was something they could do. They knew how to run and they had blood. There were people who were offering homes and meals for people who might be stranded because that's what they had to offer. In moments of stress and suffering, this is a basic human instinct to do something, to give back in some way. And making that choice in difficult situations is actually incredibly protective. That when you are a part of something that is incredibly destructive or overwhelming, one of the only ways to avoid the despair and the overwhelming grief and the sense of nothing making sense, one of the only ways to get through that is to find some way to help others.
Dr. McGonigal, how has your research changed your own life?
Rethinking stress has had some surprising effects in my own life. I mentioned that it helped me deal with anxiety, but some ways that surprised me even more than that were the sense of gratitude that I found springing up in really unexpected situations, in caring for a sick loved one, or feeling overwhelmed by the tasks that I had to do for a work project, that sort of out of nowhere, this feeling of gratitude would pop up. And, like the physiology of gratitude, it's a real biological and psychological experience that I usually don't associate with stress. Usually my core emotional response would be something more like resentment than gratitude. Like, why does this have to be this way? Why is this happening? Why isn't the universe conspiring to make this easy and smooth the way it should be? And I think that even though I have no idea why gratitude was such an unexpected result of rethinking stress and embracing stress, I've come to the conclusion that this mindset towards stress that says rather than trying to avoid or suppress it, we really should be looking for ways to use it as a catalyst for something positive, and that we can trust ourselves to do that, that it seems to function as a kind of balancing opposite to whatever is toxic about our own personal experience of stress. And for me, probably what was most toxic about stress that I hadn't worked through yet was this feeling of resentment, that life should be different somehow, that I should be able to have an interesting and challenging job without stress, or that I should be able to experience love and family without experiencing suffering and loss, and that's not really the way the world works. And somehow embracing stress kind of broke through that particular toxic mindset and produced its opposite, its healing opposite, gratitude. And when I talk with some of my students who have worked with me in rethinking stress, they often describe things like that, a kind of healing opposite popping up spontaneously that really counters what was for them most toxic about their experience of stress or suffering.
Dr. McGonigal, what is the take-home message from your book, The Upside of Stress?
I think the take-home message of the book and of the research is that it really isn't most helpful to focus on the question of whether stress is good or stress is bad. That the most interesting and important question that we can be asking, whether as scientists or psychologists or as human beings who experience stress, that the really useful question is, how can I transform stress into something positive? And I really think that the stance we choose to take towards stress matters. And in some ways, that stance is more than just a belief that says stress could be good. It's a kind of attitude or orientation towards stress that counters the prevailing way that we think and relate to stress, that we actually can trust ourselves to handle both the inner experience of stress, all the emotions and the thoughts and the sensations that we think we can't feel or handle, and also that we can trust ourselves to handle the circumstances of our lives that we wouldn't necessarily choose, or the ones that we did choose and have turned out to be more stressful than we expected. There's something about this quality of trust that I think underlies the mindset towards stress that is most likely to transform people's experience of stress.
Dr. Kelly McGonigal, we want to thank you so much for talking with us today on the People's Pharmacy and also for writing this wonderful book.
Well, thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Dr. Kelly McGonigal, author of The Upside of Stress, Why Stress is Good for You and How to Get Good at It. She's a health psychologist and lecturer at Stanford University. Her previous book was The Willpower Instinct. Her website is kellymcgonigal.com. You'll find a link to it from our website.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered it. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
If you would like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1009. That number again, 800-732-2334. You can also place your order online at peoplespharmacy.com. And when you go to our website, look for our Listen and Read offer that includes Dr. McGonigal's book, The Upside of Stress, along with the CD.
You can also check out information on prescription drugs, herbal medicines, and home remedies. Share your own experience and thoughts on today's show.
At the website, you can also sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show. You need never miss another People's Pharmacy program, and you can share it with a friend. It's all there at peoplespharmacy.com.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks so much for listening today, and please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.